You think standing alone makes you strong, but isolation exposes weakness. Without discipline, solitude turns you visible, predictable, and easy to break by colder men. You were taught to admire the man who stands alone. The myth says solitude equals independence, that cutting people off automatically makes you powerful. That belief is sentimental. Power does not come from being alone. Power comes from control, and isolation without control is exposure. When you stand alone, there is no crowd to hide your weaknesses, no noise to blur your indecision, no alliances to absorb your mistakes. Every flaw becomes visible to others and, more dangerously, to yourself. Most men mistake this discomfort for growth. It isn't. It's just unprotected terrain. Isolation is not strength by default. It is a condition, like being wounded on a battlefield. If you are trained, it sharpens you. If you are undisciplined, it kills you slowly. The reason solitude feels deep or pure to weak men is simple. It removes judgment. No one is watching. No one is correcting you. No one is challenging your delusions. In isolation, you can lie to yourself without resistance. That is not freedom. That is rot. Strong systems do not rely on emotion. They rely on rules. Armies, empires, machines, none of them survive on feeling. A man alone who follows feeling becomes erratic. His sleep drifts, his routines soften, his standards erode. He calls it peace. In reality, he is becoming predictable. Machiavelli understood this. When external order disappears, internal law must replace it. Not motivation, not inspiration, law. Clear commands you obey even when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it. Most men collapse in isolation because they treat it like a vacation from discipline. They wake up later. They think more instead of acting. They indulge memory, fantasy, resentment. Isolation amplifies whatever is already inside you. If what's inside is unresolved weakness, isolation does not heal it, it multiplies it. This is why isolation exposes men instead of strengthening them. You are alone with your habits, alone with your excuses, alone with your lack of structure. There is no social pressure to keep you sharp, so your edge dulls without you noticing. Predators understand this pattern. Systems understand it. History understands it. The man who withdraws without replacing external control with internal command becomes soft, invisible, and easy to manage, not immediately, but inevitably. Standing alone is only dangerous if you mistake it for power. Real power begins when you assume the opposite, that solitude is hostile territory, that it must be governed, patrolled, and controlled like an enemy city. You don't enjoy isolation, you use it. You don't drift in it, you operate inside it. You impose schedules, constraints, and rules harsher than society ever did. Not because you are broken, but because without pressure, men decay. Isolation removes excuses. That is its real function. There is no one to blame, no one to impress, no one to save you from your own inconsistency. If you fail here, it is because you were never strong, only distracted. This chapter shifts the lens. Being alone is not an achievement. It is a test, and tests don't reward comfort. They reward obedience to a code, a structure, a command that does not negotiate with your mood. If you stand alone and feel free, you are already losing. Freedom is a luxury of men protected by systems. When you are alone, you don't need freedom, you need order. That is the foundation. Without it, everything that follows collapses. When you are alone, there is no external authority correcting you, no hierarchy above you, no consequences arriving on schedule. This is where most men fail.
They confuse the absence of command with autonomy. In reality, the absence of command creates a vacuum, and vacuum is always filled by impulse, by weakness, by decay. Obedience is not submission to another man. It is submission to a system that does not care how you feel. Alone, you either obey something or you obey yourself, and the self, unregulated, is unreliable. Your mind is not a leader. It is a survival organ. It seeks comfort, distraction, validation, and relief from pressure. In isolation, it becomes louder. It negotiates, it delays, it rationalizes. If you follow it, you don't become free, you become fragmented. This is why isolated men drift. They don't collapse dramatically, they erode. Small permissions stack up. One skipped rule becomes a pattern. One delayed action becomes habit. Soon, nothing is enforced, and without enforcement, identity dissolves. Machiavellian power begins with one brutal realization. Discipline must not depend on emotion. If obedience is conditional, it is fake. Real command operates regardless of mood, energy, or belief. The obedience mechanism is simple, but unforgiving. You establish non-negotiable rules, then you obey them without interpretation. No debate, no reflection, no self-dialogue. Orders are executed, not discussed. Most men cannot do this because they secretly believe they deserve exceptions. They believe isolation entitles them to softness. They reward themselves for suffering by lowering standards. This is not resilience. This is self-corruption. Look at any effective structure. Military units, intelligence agencies, elite organizations. They do not rely on motivation. They rely on protocol. Protocol removes decision fatigue. It eliminates inner negotiation. It keeps action clean. When you are alone, protocol replaces society. Without it, your mind becomes the weakest link in the chain. Obedience creates pressure. Pressure creates shape. Shape creates identity. This is not philosophy. This is mechanics. A man who obeys a strict internal system becomes predictable to himself and unreadable to others. His routines harden. His reactions narrow. His emotional range shrinks. This is not a loss. This is containment. Containment is power. Men fear obedience because they associate it with inferiority. They imagine obedience as kneeling. That is slave thinking. True obedience is self-direction under constraint. It is choosing structure over comfort, law over feeling. Isolation without obedience produces obsession, paranoia, fantasy, nostalgia. The mind turns inward and starts feeding on itself. Obedience interrupts this loop. It keeps the machine pointed outward, toward execution. This is where most isolated men break. Consistency. They obey for a week. Then emotion returns. Doubt enters. They ask why. They demand meaning. The system collapses. Power does not explain itself. It enforces itself. If you need to understand every rule emotionally, you are not built for solitude. Solitude requires mechanical compliance. You act first. Meaning follows later, if it comes at all. The obedience mechanism is not about becoming rigid. It is about becoming reliable. Reliable men survive isolation. Unreliable men romanticize it, then disappear. This chapter installs the core principle. When you are alone, you do not follow instinct. You follow command. Anything else is slow self-destruction.
Not all men who stand alone are the same. Isolation selects, but it does not equalize. Some men sharpen under it. Most deteriorate. The difference is not intelligence or talent. It is orientation. Why the man is alone determines what isolation does to him. The first archetype is the exile. This man tells himself he chose solitude, but he didn't. he was pushed out by rejection, humiliation, failure, or quiet irrelevance. His isolation is reactive. He retreats to protect his ego, not to build power. Inside, he is still negotiating with the past. He replays conversations. He imagines vindication. Isolation becomes a theater for grievance. This man does not grow colder, he grows bitter. Predators sense this immediately. The second archetype is the ascetic pretender. He glorifies isolation as virtue. He talks about simplicity, peace, and detachment, but his discipline is cosmetic. He removes pleasure, not weakness. He avoids chaos instead of mastering it. His isolation is clean but soft. Over time, his edge disappears. He becomes morally superior and strategically irrelevant. History forgets men like this quickly. The third archetype is the observer. This man withdraws to watch. He studies people, systems, power flows. He reduces interaction to minimize exposure. This is closer to strength, but still incomplete. Observation without execution turns into paralysis. The observer risks becoming invisible even to himself. Knowledge piles up, action decays. Without pressure, his clarity becomes sterile. Then there is the archetype that survives, the operator. The operator does not isolate to escape, he isolates to reduce noise. His solitude is not emotional, it is strategic. He replaces social validation with internal metrics. He doesn't ask how he feels, he checks whether the system ran, whether the command was executed, whether the day produced output. The operator understands something the others don't. Isolation is not identity, it is a position. He does not romanticize being alone, he uses it to recalibrate dominance. His routines are harder than social life ever demanded. His standards are higher. His internal penalties are immediate. There is no audience, so there is no performance, only function. The exile collapses because he is still socially oriented. The ascetic stagnates because he avoids friction. The observer stalls because he refuses commitment. The operator survives because he commits to structure without witnesses. Most men believe they are operators. They are not. Operators are rare because they require something men resist, self-enforced consequence. When an operator fails a rule, he does not rationalize, he corrects. When he breaks a standard, he increases pressure. He treats himself like a system under audit, not a wounded animal needing comfort. This is why isolation destroys most men. It exposes which archetype you actually are. If your solitude is filled with memory, you are an exile. If it is filled with moral pride, you are an ascetic. If it is filled with analysis and delay, you are an observer. Only if it is filled with execution are you an operator. Isolation amplifies archetype, it does not transform it. That is the brutal truth. You do not become stronger alone, you become more yourself. And what you are is undisciplined, resentful, or hesitant. Solitude will carve that deeper into you. This chapter forces classification. There is no comfort here. You are one of these men right now, and isolation is already shaping the outcome. The question is not which archetype you admire, it is which one your behavior proves. Isolation does not make you invisible. That is the lie men tell themselves to feel safe. In reality, isolation removes camouflage. When you step away from groups, routines, and social noise, you become easier to read, easier to predict, easier to place. In groups, weakness is diffused. In isolation, it is concentrated. History is clear on this. Lone figures without structure are not feared. They are hunted, absorbed, or erased. Empires do not fall on battlefields first. They rot at the edges, where control thins and oversight disappears. A man alone without internal governance is an edge case, and edge cases are where systems apply pressure. Isolation exposes three things immediately: your patterns, your timing, and your tolerances.
Your patterns become visible because nothing interrupts them. You wake at the same time, you move at the same pace, you consume the same inputs. Over time, this creates a rhythm that can be anticipated. Predictability is not peace. Predictability is vulnerability. Your timing degrades next. Without external deadlines or observers, urgency fades. You delay without consequence. You tell yourself you have time. This is fatal thinking. Time without pressure does not expand, it dissolves. Men who believe they are waiting are usually decaying. Finally, your tolerances shift. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes normal. Lower output, softer standards, less resistance. Isolation recalibrates your sense of threat downward unless something forces it back up. This is how isolation exposes men to exploitation, not immediately, but structurally. Predators do not look for loud weakness, they look for quiet softness. The man who believes no one is watching is the man who stops guarding himself. He overshares, he relaxes, he becomes readable. Systems exploit this too. Bureaucracies, hierarchies, markets, they all absorb solitary men who lack leverage. Without alliances or internal discipline, the solitary man becomes compliant, not because he is forced, but because resistance requires energy he no longer generates. Human nature does not reward solitude, it tests it. Every culture has examples of men who withdrew without preparation, hermits who went mad, thinkers who spiraled into obsession, warriors who lost edge once the war ended. Isolation removed friction, and friction was the only thing keeping them sharp. This chapter is not about fear, it is about exposure. When you are alone, there is no corrective feedback loop. Errors persist longer, delusions grow unchecked. You begin mistaking comfort for stability. That is when decay becomes invisible to you, but obvious to others. This is why isolation is a selection filter. Not everyone is meant to survive it. Only men with internal enforcement mechanisms make it through intact. Weak men imagine isolation as safety. Strong men understand it as danger that must be managed. If you stand alone and feel unseen, you misunderstand the terrain. You are not hidden, you are stripped. Every inefficiency is now yours alone. Every weakness is now unmasked. Every delay compounds. Isolation does not protect you from the world. It exposes whether you were ever built to face it without buffers. This chapter tightens the threat. Solitude is not neutral. It is an environment that amplifies consequences. It rewards precision and punishes drift. Those who fail here do not fail loudly. They fade. They become manageable. They become irrelevant. And irrelevance is the most permanent defeat.
Once you understand that isolation is hostile territory, the response is no longer emotional. You do not cope, you adapt. You restructure yourself the way a commander restructures a position under siege. This is where most men hesitate, because the response requires removing comfort entirely. The Machiavellian response to isolation is not withdrawal, it is consolidation. First, you weaponize routine. Not flexible routine, not productive when I feel like it routine. Hard, repetitive, almost mechanical behavior. You wake, move, work, train, and shut down at fixed times. This is not self-help, this is fortification. Predictable internal rhythm prevents mental drift and collapses indecision. Your routine must be boring by design. Boredom starves impulse. Impulse is the enemy in isolation. Second, you reduce inputs aggressively. Isolation with high stimulation destroys judgment. Endless information, entertainment, opinion, it fragments focus. The Machiavellian response is selective deprivation. You limit what enters your mind so execution becomes the default state. Less thinking, more doing. Clarity comes from constraint, not abundance. Third, you replace emotion with metrics. Feelings are irrelevant data in isolation. They fluctuate without consequence. Metrics don't. Output measured daily, physical standards enforced weekly, financial, cognitive, or tactical progress tracked without interpretation. If the number doesn't move, something is wrong. You correct it immediately. This is how you prevent the softening that destroys solitary men. You externalize accountability into systems you cannot negotiate with. Fourth, you cultivate controlled invisibility. This does not mean disappearing completely. It means reducing unnecessary exposure. You speak less. You explain nothing. You do not broadcast struggle or intent. Visibility without leverage invites interference. Silence buys time. Machiavelli warned that men reveal themselves too easily when they feel unobserved. The response is restraint. You assume you are always being evaluated by rivals, by systems, by opportunity itself. Fifth, you impose penalties. Most men only reward themselves. That creates imbalance. In isolation, rewards without penalties produce entitlement. You correct failure with immediate consequence. Missed execution is paid for with discomfort, restriction, or additional labor. This keeps standards sharp. This is not cruelty, it is maintenance. The Machiavellian response removes negotiation from daily life. You do not ask what you want, you execute what is required. Desire becomes irrelevant, requirement becomes law. This shift is where identity begins to change. You stop seeing yourself as a man going through isolation. You become a man operating under conditions. Emotion recedes, function dominates. This is how isolation becomes an advantage instead of a liability, not by self-expression, by self-command. Men who fail here cling to comfort. They soften routines. They justify exceptions. They reintroduce noise. Within months, they are weaker than before they withdrew. Men who succeed become difficult to read, difficult to disrupt, difficult to control. Their solitude becomes compressed power, stored, not wasted. This chapter installs the response. Isolation demands structure, silence, and enforcement. Anything less is surrender disguised as independence. Isolation is not complete until the previous version of you is eliminated, not improved, not healed, eliminated. The man who needed approval, explanation, belonging, or recognition cannot survive prolonged solitude without corrupting it. He must be removed. Most men try to carry their old identity into isolation. They keep the same values, the same emotional reflexes, the same need to be understood, just without people around. This creates internal conflict. The old identity was built for social environments. It feeds on feedback. When that feedback disappears, it destabilizes. You feel this as restlessness, emptiness, a quiet pressure to re-enter the world prematurely. That pressure is not loneliness, it is withdrawal. The old identity is starving. Machiavellian transformation requires letting it die. Identity death is not dramatic, it is surgical. You stop defending who you were. You stop explaining your motives to yourself. You stop preserving traits that no longer serve function. Nostalgia is treated as contamination. Memory becomes data, not comfort. The new identity is colder, narrower, and harder to access emotionally. It is built around execution, not expression, around sovereignty, not connection, around survival and leverage, not meaning. This is where many men panic. They feel themselves becoming less human, less reactive, less emotionally available. They mistake this for loss. It is not loss, it is compression. A blade is not weak because it lacks softness.
The replacement identity operates on a few brutal principles. You are not here to be understood. You are not here to be liked. You are not here to feel whole. You are here to function. This identity does not seek validation. It measures outcomes. It does not chase coherence or happiness. It enforces standards. It does not need narrative. It needs results. When this identity installs, your relationship with isolation changes. Silence no longer feels heavy. It becomes neutral. Time no longer feels empty. It becomes usable. You stop counting days. You stop waiting for something to end. Isolation becomes baseline. This is the final separation between men who merely endure solitude and men who are rebuilt by it. The former return to the world unchanged, resentful, and weaker. The latter return altered, less visible, less predictable, more dangerous. Identity death is irreversible. Once you experience life without the need to be seen, you cannot go back to performing. Once you function without emotional negotiation, you cannot tolerate internal chaos again. This is the cost and the advantage. The man who emerges from this phase is no longer lonely. He is independent of resonance. He does not need alignment. He does not seek mirroring. He operates. This completes the transformation. The old self was a liability in isolation. The new self is built for it. What remains is a final warning about what happens if you reverse this process and who is allowed to carry this identity forward.
What you have built up to this point is unstable by design. It is not meant to be comfortable, sustainable for everyone, or shared widely. This final warning exists for one reason: to prevent dilution. Most men should not complete this process. They hear fragments of it and mimic the aesthetics: silence, detachment, minimalism, without internal enforcement. They adopt the posture without the pressure. These men are the most dangerous to themselves. They become cold on the surface and hollow underneath. That is not power. That is fragility disguised as control. If you reverse this process, if you reintroduce emotional dependence after killing the old identity, you do not return to who you were. You become worse, more cynical, more erratic, less capable of trust, and less capable of command. Half-transformed men rot faster than uninitiated ones. This is why the identity you've installed is selective. It does not coexist with indulgence. It does not tolerate drift. It does not survive explanation. The moment you start talking about this identity, seeking recognition for it, or using it to posture, you have already compromised it. Power that needs to be seen is already leaking. This is also why not everyone should stand alone. Isolation is not a virtue, it is a filter. Most men are meant to be contained by systems, relationships, routines imposed from outside. Remove those supports and they collapse inward. Only a small fraction are capable of internal governance strong enough to replace the external world. If you are not enforcing structure daily, this path will hollow you. If you are not executing without emotion, it will confuse you. If you are not prepared to lose resonance permanently, it will damage you. This is the final line. You do not try to be this man. You either are capable of sustaining him or you are not. There is no gradual entry, no safe version, no applause at the end. If you carry this identity forward, you do so silently. You do not recruit. You do not convert. You do not warn others unless they are already standing alone and failing. This is not a movement. It is not a philosophy. It is not self-improvement. It is a survival posture for men who cannot afford softness and cannot tolerate illusion. If that does not describe you, step away now. Reattach to structure elsewhere. This path does not forgive hesitation. And if it does describe you, you already know what comes next. Silence, execution, no return.